This is Van Electric Ghost, and we're live on the air with Susan Miller. And you're basically you work with writing come of age stories for for young adults, right?
Yes, currently. I've
That's your focus now.
worn some different hats, but that's the current focus.
Yeah, young adult fiction. But we're gonna tell your story once we get into the heart of the episode. But we always ask a couple of questions of any guest that comes on the show. What motivates you, and why do you do what you do?
Okay. Well, I guess might be a couple of different answers because there are a couple of different things that I do. But I'll say something first about the writing, which is one of my longstanding activities, both fiction and nonfiction writing. And I'd say, to answer your question with respect to the writing, there is just something um, especially enjoyable about being able to create something that hadn't existed before. And I'm guessing that most people who engage in something creative, whether it's painting or writing music or baking great cakes,
Hmm.
they probably all share that just special joy. Of course, there's a lot of challenge also, and maybe that's part of the joy is the seeing how challenging it is and being able to confront that and sometimes get through and create something you're happy with. So I think that's at the core with the writing. Um, with my work as a psychologist, people are interesting, people are engaging. So I think that work is gratifying in a number of different levels, just the human connection, always the challenge of trying to understand why a person might be having the difficulties they're having is intellectually
Hmm.
engaging, like puzzle solving. Um, and then, of course, the effort to be of help to someone who's struggling with something is also a part of it, big part
Do
of
you,
it.
do you feel being a clinical psychologist helps with your writing in terms of understanding human nature and then be able to kind of build that into your characters?
I think it does. Sometimes when you do something for a long time, the way I have with being a psychologist, you may actually be the last person to be able to see how it's impacted you. So, as a psychologist, in a way, your mind is sort of full of other people's lives and their stories and the way they present themselves to you. And sometimes you're aware of that, and sometimes it's just there. It's kind of the air you breathe. So it probably feeds other parts of your life in ways you may be only partly aware of.
Yeah.
But certainly, working with people as a psychologist, it gives you the beginnings of characters sometimes, although you have to be very careful about that because of people's privacy and
Hmm.
confidentiality. And it also calls your attention to sort of the richness of a human being, right? So when you work with somebody in the office, you have stories that they tell you about their present, about their past, but at the same time, you have the content of the stories, but you also have the delivery of the stories. So, like now, I'm telling you a story right now, and I'm noticing I use my hands all over the place.
Yeah.
Well, not everybody does, or some people use their hands symmetrically, and some people use them, one at a time. So, when you're creating a character in a book, those kinds of observations that you might do of people when you're working with them are are very helpful.
Yeah. I think
Yeah.
it's like the nature of being a creative, like being a clinical psychologist. If you're not in that profession, you're just a creative, right? Like I'm a songwriter. Songwriter is a storyteller, but it's a shorter
Sure.
form.
Yeah.
than an author. Like our stories maybe go, if in the 1970s, they might go 12, 15 minutes. Nowadays, they go
Okay.
4 or 5.
Shorter.
But,
Yeah.
but I'm a child of the 70s, so my songs go long. But, but the idea is like you observe, like it's like the muse gives you the ability to channel, like the way the Victorians used to talk. I
Hmm.
always get inspired by the idea of the muse, but it's like in your subconscious, right?
Hmm.
The stuff that comes out, and then there's stuff that you feel from the outside. So it's like in and out. It's like a merging of microcosm, macrocosm, and internal,
Yeah.
external. But
Yeah.
being a clinical psychologist, that you understand like the frame it from a like an intellectual point of view, or from a doctor's point of view, versus just a creative coming up with something like, oh, I observed this, but you've got some science behind your observations.
That's true. Although I don't tend to use that so
Oh, you
much,
don't
you
use
know.
that as much. Oh,
In fact, I sometimes, for example, right now I'm working on a novel where there's a character who has some like symptoms, right? That a professional mental health worker might diagnose in a certain way. And
mm-hmm.
then based on that diagnosis, you might expect the character's symptoms to sort of evolve in a certain way. Well, that doesn't work too well for me as a fiction writer right now. So I'm trying to think through.
So you break the rules a little
Yeah,
bit.
yeah, even breaking the rules of the illness. In other words,
Yeah,
does the
be
does the
more creative.
does the fictional, psychosis have to follow the rules
Yeah,
of the
maybe it's not as
actual?
interesting. It might
Maybe
not be as interesting.
it might not. Well, right, and so maybe this will be a fictional mental illness in a sense, one that doesn't necessarily exist in the real world, but is interesting in helping a reader understand something about this character's inner life. So that's something I'm kind of playing with right now.
Yeah, that makes
Yeah.
a lot of sense because a lot of times in the creative world, like it's not exactly real life. It's like it could be inspired by real life, but you tend to, in order to get somebody to pull somebody into your story or keep somebody's attention, sometimes you have to do something from a more, maybe it's a creative bent rather than what it would be in actuality might not actually keep
Right,
somebody
right. Yeah.
interested.
And when I'd rather err on the side of freeing up your creative mind to,
Mm,
maybe create something
more
a little
expansive.
different from what you might observe. Yeah. Yeah. So don't
Well,
be
yeah, it's
too
like
don't be
or
too strict about the rules of,
I like the canon.
reality.
Well, it's
Yeah.
like the idea of the canon. Like if you're like a jazz musician, everybody thinks like bebop is the standard. But
Uh-huh.
then when you break it, like Miles Davis was a bebop standard, right?
Hmm.
And he broke it with fusion. And people are like, how could you do that? Because like they said, well, bebop is the canon. So how could you do something outside the canon? Because he was getting bored with the bebop.
That's
So,
right.
so
Yeah.
sometimes like and people to this day they think that bebop that's the standard. Kind of like Shakespeare or something. It's like you got to stay inside these lines. You got to stay in the box. A lot of times, even if you're a master of that box, you get bored with it and you go
Yeah.
outside of it.
Hmm. Well, and in psychology, Freud was a major thinker, and people learned a great deal from him. And then a certain orthodoxy developed where if people would deviate from his thinking, they would be perhaps critiqued, chastised for being deviant. But others would say, well, Freud actually was a revolutionary. If he had continued to live, he would have thrown out
Change his own stuff. You would
three
change his
quarters of his own ideas. He kept revising, he kept changing. So why would you want to
yeah,
lock it
locked
in?
in.
Yeah, yeah. So
Well, that's the
I
problem.
prefer that way of thinking myself.
Well, cross
But
genre is always interesting because I mean, you've done nonfiction, you've done fiction, right? Or you've done psychology books. I'm assuming those are nonfiction, or are those fictional too?
those are nonfiction, yeah. Or
Do you
I,
find
I
as
could make a joke about it and say they're
say it is
fiction,
fiction?
but I'm hoping they're nonfiction for the most part. You know?
But, do you find that, like, I've found some authors, like, they're nonfiction authors, like, they have a hard time writing fiction, or fiction authors have a hard time writing, nonfiction. Did you have any kind of, challenge when you decided to go into, one or the other? Or did you always kind of work with both?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. I think I was first drawn to fiction at a very young age. And I suppose in a way most human beings are, because we start out life with stories, and so most kids are engaged by fiction and then they start kind of telling stories. So, that was me, but I took it seriously. I was very interested in it at a young age. And the nonfiction really grew out of going to graduate school to
Mhm.
become a psychologist. And suddenly I was required to write nonfiction because I had to write a master's thesis and a
Part of your career path.
dissertation. Yeah, yeah. And
Very
kind of
cool.
put this fiction aside. And then, I recognized after a while that some of the nonfiction could be publishable, shareable. Um, so yeah, it wasn't too difficult for me because I think I had also grown up with teachers actually who were good teachers helping their students to think about essay writing. And so I think that kind of fed into
Opened it up.
the
Yeah,
nonfiction. But
yeah.
actually, the first nonfiction that I published, I had written a dissertation, which I had to do to become a psychologist. And um, my father actually had read it and said, "Well, hey, Sue, why don't you see if you could get it published as a book?" Because it happened to be the format was pretty
Close to it.
discursive, narrative. And
Mhm.
that
So we
had
would
not
work.
crossed my mind in any way. I just trying to get my degree. Um, but I thought, okay, well, maybe he knows something I don't. So I sent it off to a number of publishers, and I got a couple rejections, and then I got a letter from a man who knows if he's out there somewhere, but his name was Baxter Venables. It was a funny kind of memorable name. And
Mhm.
I think he was bored the day he got my manuscript because he wrote me a little letter and he said, "You're going about this all wrong. And this is the way these are the kinds of publishers you need to write to. This is what you need to say." And he even pointed me in the direction of a particular publisher we thought might be interested. And sure enough, that publisher
Well,
ended
that's
up
a rare
publishing three books of mine and was a good publisher. So I owe that man some gratitude. I
well,
don't
that's
know.
rare that
Yeah,
somebody actually points you in the right direction instead of just saying, "Well, that's not my call to do that." But those are
right.
the people that really open up your life when you get somebody that actually takes that extra step with you.
Yeah, he had a big impact. I probably wrote him back and thanked him, but if I didn't, I should have. Yeah.
So your current YA novel is By the Way I Love You. Is that out now?
It's out. It came out about 2 months ago. The almost end of October. Yeah.
So in the series of all your YA work, is this like the first book in that series, or is this a part of a continuing
No,
uh
this is the first young adult novel that I've written. I did write a psychology book, a self-help type book
mhm,
for young adults, and it is an age group that I think I've been drawn to because the other novels that I've published have had central young adult characters,
characters?
but they
Okay.
really were targeted to an older audience.
Hmm.
So this is the first,
Targeted.
yeah, yeah. And in fact, when I wrote it, I don't know that I was sure what audience, but when I showed it to my editor, when the draft was done, and she asked me, well, what questions you want me to answer after I read it or as I'm reading? And I said, well, who's the audience? Is this
Hmm.
for young adults or?
Yeah, yeah. You got to
And
pitch
then
it.
she came back and she said, oh yeah, it's for young adults. So I'm like, okay, there you go.
It's good that you knew like how to pitch it because that's a big problem sometimes as an artist. I run into songwriters and it's like, well, what I'm doing is not really in this genre, but they want to pitch it in the genre.
Oh yeah, I think you're right. I wasn't sure, and I appreciated that input from a good editor, very valuable individual.
So, in terms of this book, did you, as a writer, had you had like beta readers and tried it out with the your beta readers, or did you already have
Yeah,
like an audience that you sent this to check out?
yeah, I have a writing group, like I think a lot of writers do have a group, and this particular, I've had various ones over the years, but the current writing group is actually other psychologists. So
Oh, cool.
they're writing psychology, but I've been writing fiction and sort of asking them to,
Check it out.
yeah, they read fiction recreationally, so they've pretty much been my readers in recent years, and occasionally I'll ask a friend, but they've been the main readers. So they were giving me some feedback as I went, and sometimes just encouragement you need to keep going
Yeah,
when you're
that's a
writing.
thing.
It
But I
is
guess
when, yeah, with a long project, especially, sometimes you get, or I'd say not sometimes, but almost always in my case, you get about halfway through and you think,
get a block.
why did I start this? Maybe I should quit it. It was a
Oh
bad
yeah,
idea.
all that's bad self-talk. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Well, that's the
yeah,
stuff that either procrastinates, you never get the project done because then you're like, well, why am I doing this? And but
yeah.
what
Or
makes you want to
you lose
break through?
confidence in it sometimes for a while. I sometimes I've had there's a little lake that I sometimes go swimming in, lovely little lake, and sometimes when I'm writing, I'll have this image that I'm in the middle of the lake, like halfway across, and thinking that the lake is pretty big, and maybe I should just give up and go back.
Go
But I
back
tell
is too
myself, well, you're in the middle, you're
just
halfway
finish it.
across. The far shore is just as close as the near shore, so just keep
Keep
going.
not going.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that's the difference between somebody who actually can finish something. Once like I think it's always like getting over the hurdle. When I work with a lot of creators, is like the ones who kind of like have a lot of stops and starts
Hmm.
versus people who actually have a lot of content. Like I've
Uh-huh.
run into like artists where there's like all these half finished things,
Yeah,
pieces, and then it's like then I run into artists have totally tons of completed work, and
yeah.
then and then then that work was presented, and then you're
Yes.
like, so what makes you be the person that actually
Uh-huh.
presents?
Yeah, that's a really a good question. The other thing that helps me a lot is very basic, but it's just put one foot in front of the other. Don't always look if you look at the big picture, you can just overwhelm yourself.
Mm,
But if you look at, well, what can I do today? Can I sit down today and write a few paragraphs? Yeah, I could usually do that.
yeah,
So if
little
you just
wins.
keep your, yeah, and it's amazing how much you can get done just biting off the
Little
little,
bite-sized pieces.
yeah, mm-hmm,
But it's like if you're like an artist, like a musician, a lot of times it's like I just do these recording sessions of my rehearsals because I don't know if that rehearsal is actually going to be the song. And,
oh
and
yeah,
and you go back and you listen to the tapes and you find, like 5 minutes in, this is it, or that
uh-huh,
there's something on this other tape, And I was watching like this documentary, like Frank Zappa used to. They had these pictures of him in his room, and he had this like living room with all these tapes. He was just sitting in the middle of the room, and he had tons of tapes from all over the place. And he's going and looking at each one of them
Ah.
and kind of pulling things from, you know, a hodgepodge way of looking at things. He wouldn't always be sequential. He would grab
Yeah,
things from different
yeah.
points in time, different projects, and then mix them together. Do you find that you like to just go through one project or and finish it, or have ideas that kind of percolate from other things and kind of piecemeal?
With the fiction writing, I try and stay with one project, and sometimes it's hard because you have another idea and you think maybe I should just jump ship.
Jump to that one.
But I try not to because each project has so many elements, so I might jump around within the project, like work on this part of it, then work on this part of it, then reorder things.
Yeah, different
But
things
to
too.
leave the frame totally, if it's a novel, I don't want to do that because I got too many. It's hard enough to keep track of
Come
all
back
the.
into it if you leave. Yeah, like if
Yeah,
you
yeah,
leave, then you won't come back.
yeah. And sometimes I've had to, like with this book just coming out recently, um, I had to put aside what I was working on in order do to respond to the editor's comments and even do another big re-edit responding to the editor's comments. That meant I had to leave aside the project that had already gotten underway. Just had to do it. And
Yeah, yeah, things
okay,
get
but
sequenced.
yeah, 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 yeah.
So, I guess in terms of like this whole young adult market, like you said that you had characters in some other books that were like young adults, and then
Yeah.
you decided to kind of like, whoa, why don't I just focus on these young adults as the protagonists? Is that what happened? You decided that you want to tell their story?
In the other books, there were young adult protagonists too, but the tone and the subject matter was really
Or
pitched to an older person, and often it was the subject matter because it would be a pretty, maybe a heavier theme,
heavier? Okay.
a little more complex and might work for the younger audience. But so in this case, yeah, again, young adult protagonist, but it just seemed to have a lighter tone, and maybe the humor in it was such
Hmm.
that it seemed more like I was speaking
Yeah,
to the
maybe you can
kids. Yeah.
reach that high school or scholastic,
Yeah,
audience.
yeah,
You
yeah. And
know,
also the subject matter in this case, it's about a girl who's starting college, and um, her experiences, which a lot of young people would identify with,
really too.
and even, not just kids starting college, but maybe a young person leaving home for any reason. Could be going to the military, or could be
Mm,
just moving to a different community, but taking that leap out of their family home.
mhm.
So really, that's at the heart of what I was looking at and trying to look at.
Coming of age type of ideas.
Yeah, but for a particular, or in this particular case, it's coming of age for somebody who had quite a lot of baggage from earlier in life because she had lost a parent not too
Mhm.
long before making this transition. And of course, most people, probably everybody, has some baggage from their earlier years, um, different for different people. And so when they take that leap into adulthood, they're going to be taking with them some of the things that they haven't worked out very well
Mhm.
earlier in life. So in this case, the impact of the mother's death, but also questions that the character has about kind of who was she for her mother and who was her mother for her, all that comes with her to college, and in some ways gets in her way, and in other ways motivates her. So,
The thing about when you read a book, you kind of like as a reader, you start to picture like a cinematic scene in your mind, right? And so I'm wondering, like, when you write, do you have those kind of cinematic, like, scale ideas, or is it just the I don't know, the thriller or the drama of what you're writing? But do you think in terms of like the visual impact of the descriptions of the scenes and it seems like everybody's so into like video today that even when you
yeah, that
write a
that
book, you can't write 200,000 pages now. Words you have to do 70,000, 90,000. So like, are you limited in what you can describe, and what can you do with the limitations of the way the market is?
yeah, that's an interesting question. I do think it's important to have a lot of visual imagery in mind when you're, or it's helpful when you're writing, because usually what fiction writers try and do is to evoke as many of the senses as you can in a particular moment, with the idea that if there's a visual element and maybe an olfactory element, and just as many senses as you can bring into the moment, that's enriching. uh,
Hmm.
I don't know. I sometimes think that the visual isn't my strong suit, even though I like to paint, but
Hmm.
just imagining the whole scene, the space that the person is occupying physically, isn't always the easiest part for me. I think dialogue comes
You're more of a
more
dialogue, right?
easily.
Yeah,
And maybe that's, I'm a therapist.
your style.
I'm
Yeah, your
listening to
style is
I'm listening to words all
voice.
day.
But you're in the voice. You're in the
Yeah,
space of the voice being the primary
yeah,
thing.
that's right. In fact, when
Or-
I finished a book and it's done, my work is done, and then the publisher will start to talk to you about the cover.
Oh, what it should
And
look like.
I I always enjoy that, because it's like suddenly an element from a completely different,
Different
not
genre,
from, yeah, yeah.
different
And
type
of
of art.
course, I don't have to design it. I get to be a consultant, but it's fun to, I don't know, to get that
Yeah,
visual to
it's
go
kind
with
of
all
like if
those words.
when you're a musician and you're working with like somebody doing the cover of the album, it's the
Hmm.
same idea. It's the same kind of
Same
idea.
thing. Yeah,
Or if you work with them to try to do a video.
yeah.
And then you give it to a director and you say, you know what, you just interpret what it is, and they interpret something that's out of left field. It like has nothing to do with what the song was, but they say, you know what, that's fine because I want you to use your artistic capability to kind of
Yeah.
dream up something. And sometimes it's like that's what you do. You go with something that has nothing to do with your original intent.
Uh,
Uh, But that's kind of a weird thing. I don't know if people do it as much as they used to. People tend to do videos now that are totally match the lyrics of the song
uh,
rather than doing something that's like totally like, well, that I
yeah.
didn't see it that way.
I did once have a book cover designed by, I think it was the son of the editor, was a photographer, and they came back with this cover, and I'm like, okay, I have no idea what this has to
But
do.
it's with the
It was
story.
it was a book on shame, and it was a photograph of some railroad tracks, and I'm like,
What's that got
you
to do
know,
with it?
yeah, I guess I could use my I guess I'm going to have to use my imagination,
To
because
figure it out.
it's a family member's project. So, but
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Is like so. I mean, you have to, which if your work and you're gonna have the input, it's like, well, I don't think that works.
yeah, yeah,
But I think it works. I think it does or it doesn't.
yeah,
But yeah, it's just when it comes together with all the themes that you want to put in a book is like how much of I mean I don't know, like natural world, you know, uh maybe like what's going on, in the society overall, or do you just stick with your overall sometimes like, I guess an example was like Rod Serling in the Twilight Zone used to take science fiction and then make comments about society through the science fiction.
Right, right. Yeah. A combination, I'd say. I do like to, if I can find a natural way to do it, to comment on things that are important to me that are happening in the world.
Hmm.
Like with this most recent book, there's a environmental theme.
Oh, cool.
That's something that's really important to me, and I
Wove it in.
did, and I had to think about whether it was natural to, the story that I started with and the character, but I decided I could make it work, right?
You make it work, yeah.
Because I think for this particular character, part of her sort of coming of age journey was to see if she could have the kind of confidence in herself to speak up about things that mattered to her.
Well, that's
So she
people
ends
having
up,
toys.
and she ends up finding as a kind of refuge a piece of land that's a beautiful natural space, and then discovers that there's developers bearing down on it, and they're gonna
Wolves at the door.
wolves are at the door. And so, the question arises for her, is she just gonna just back off and swallow it, or could she
Stand up.
stand up? So that's part of her journey, is to do that. Yeah. And it's interwoven with some of the other themes
Other
in the
aspects.
book. Yeah, because one of the things she's struggling with is that when her mother was dying, the character, whose name is Leslie, was a kind of testy, rude 15-year-old kid, and just wasn't really nice to her mother and wasn't helpful or sympathetic. And then her mother died,
So she
so
feels guilt about that then.
she feels guilt, and she feels a lot of question about, well, who is she? Is she a bad person who can't care about anybody? So then, as the book, she develops this attachment to, in a sense, Mother Earth, because of this land.
She's lost her mother, yeah. But
Yeah,
she found another mother.
but she found Mother Earth. So then, but Mother Earth is in trouble too, right? Because the developers are coming for Mother Earth.
Maybe she can
So,
protect Gaia where she couldn't protect her mom.
Exactly. So that's kind of where it goes, is can she do that? Yeah.
That's cool when you have like subtext, or you have these like subplots, or like every time as a songwriter, we try. Sometimes we don't try to go for the obvious. We try to have like, maybe not, I'd say, hidden message, but metaphors or things that you like. First listen, you might not get it.
Yeah,
Third
absolutely.
listen, you might not get it. It's like when you really start to see, oh, there's actually something in here that's
And
a
that
little,
makes it so much
yeah,
richer when it's
yes.
layered up like that. Yeah.
And some people might still just hear the hook and
Right.
never really, because that's the problem with musicians. Like a lot of times, people don't really understand our lyrics because they don't really listen to them.
Mm-hmm.
They listen to the hook and then they don't really get the context of the whole thing. And so you get a lot of fans that are like, wow, they didn't actually get it.
But there's rewards there for somebody who wants to listen more closely.
Yeah. It's funny. Like once you put something out in the world, it's like you don't own it anymore.
That
So do
is
you
true.
ever run into like readers that, like, when they give you their feedback, you're wondering like, what did they read?
Yeah. Yeah, occasionally that. And then occasionally they'll give you feedback and you'll think, oh, what did I write? In other words, maybe they found something you didn't know was there.
You didn't see it. Like, you just subconsciously didn't even realize what you put in there.
That happens too, and that's pretty interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it can go either way. He's like, oh, I didn't really see that people were interpreting my song as this.
Yeah.
They think it's like,
maybe they saw something I didn't see. Yeah.
It's, oh, I didn't know that's how they're reading it. It was like, okay.
Yeah. The other thing I've been noticing, and maybe you have this experience as a songwriter too, is that sometimes some goofy element will come into my mind, as part of a story. And so, like, I was working on something, and I had this idea of tomato cans, or just showing up all over the city, like cans of tomatoes on the sidewalk, and people finding them, and I'm like, what is this
Yeah,
idea?
that comes from as like a Warhol thing.
And it doesn't, yeah, and I have no idea what this means, and if I showed it to somebody at that point, they would have said, well, get rid of these tomato cans. What do they have to do with anything? But usually I just sort of let it sit there for a while, and I'll think, well, maybe it
That would be
means
a
something.
quirky thing that you just put out
Yeah,
there, and
let me play with it for a while. And in the end, it might get thrown out, but it might be that you find you could build a bridge from that odd element to some
and
other element that suddenly is interesting. So
yeah, you get end up coming back to it later and figure out a way to
yeah, yeah. So
actually.
don't
It's like
don't
a
be
breadcrumb.
too yeah, don't be too quick to clean it up. Just let it sit around there for a while.
Well, that's kind of like the non-sequential nature of things, because sometimes you could take something and then you're like, oh, I didn't know what to do with this, and you can back into it and kind of re-describe something. Like later
R-
on, you think you could add something, and it was like kind of hanging. Instead of rewriting it, you could actually in the in the forward section of the book is like you kind of explained it. So you
y-
maybe didn't fully understand it here, but now you get it there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and if you leave those odd, sort of unsettling elements alone, yeah, sometimes they set in motion something,
Something else
that,
to trigger something else to happen.
yeah, and it may not be that conscious, like what you were saying before. Some things just come up from the unconscious space. You don't want to shut them down too quickly. You want to let them, see what they have to say. Maybe they've got some wisdom to them. So I'll hear you out before I,
Yeah,
decide.
because it's kind of like in the back of your head, you might like a lot of times in music, it's like we subconsciously like put elements of other songs in our song.
Hmm.
Not that we're trying to rip them off, but we might have put raindrops fall on my head in the middle of a song, has nothing to do with that. But that
Right.
you put in, then you have these little weird references to like these other songs. You're like,
Uh-huh.
what's going on? It's like it was kind of streaming of consciousness, but it kind of worked. And then later you'll kind of tie it together with some themes, kind of like movements in classical music. You
Yeah.
put them together and things kind of come back. You have a hint of something and it comes back, and then you fully thresh it out. Then people are like, "Oh, now I'm putting it together."
That's when things
You know,
get interesting. Right.
yeah, then it
Yeah.
all starts to weave together.
Yeah, that complexity can make things interesting, all those different threads. Yeah, I mean, you don't want chaos. They've got to
No,
relate to each other in some way, but yeah,
yeah, unless you're a punk aesthetic, then you go for the dissonance.
then you can. Yeah.
It's like that's actually the theme. The theme is dissonance.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. We were talking about before about your being a clinical psychologist and how that can affect your story development. So, in terms of like you're talking about the come of age story, and your character had some issues with her mother passing. So, like in terms of like that being a theme, maybe you can flesh that out in a certain way that maybe a different author wouldn't.
You mean because of the
Your ability,
psychologist?
yeah,
Yeah,
your
it
perspective to maybe
might.
look at what could happen based on your experience, or like what's kind of typical or
Yeah,
atypical.
it might be. I mean, in this case, this particular story actually did start with some interactions with a person in my office years ago.
Mhm.
Um, and the character that I ended up with as a young woman, actually, the person in my office was not a young woman, it was a young man. But it, and so the parallels are no longer at all
Yeah, exactly.
obvious, but
Yeah.
I think the starting place was important because what I found myself thinking about in my office was that it was a person who had lost a parent very early in life, much earlier than my character, and really didn't remember the parent much, and was starting college and having a lot of trouble, and didn't make really any connections to this very early loss. But I was able to see like the fingerprints of that loss, in some of the present day things that were happening for the person. Um, so, and it was moving. It was, you could see where the person had suffered in ways they didn't even know about. And yeah, so, um, and there were some particular things, for example, which kind of crept into the novel. So it was a young man who, as it turned out, liked to dress sometimes in women's clothing. And as I heard it, it was moving to me because I was sensing, I could have been wrong, but my guess was that there's the vague memories of this long lost mother were somehow in that clothing. It was this
Oh,
sense, the textures, the smells, of clothing, of fabric, the little bit of perfume, the feel of velvet or something
so trying to get
that kind
close
of
to it that way.
carried the memories, not consciously again. So in the book that I wrote, there's some scenes about trying on old clothes from the parent, and that was kind
Kind
of
of connected
borrowed.
to that. Oh
Yeah.
wow. Yeah, so you can take like it's like any like I think creative people we take the things that happen and then
Yeah.
find a way to weave it into like a story. Yeah,
Yeah,
and
I think of us as shameless thieves. We steal wherever we can.
but people like they think of music and like oh these people using samplers. Well, your mind takes samples.
All the time.
Your
Yeah.
man takes samples and then you write it in your voice, right?
Right, right.
And what we do as musicians, like there's only so many notes in the scales, right? There's certain forms, like like a blues form is very structured. When you
Yeah,
hear it, everybody
you
knows
know
what the
it.
blues is. There's certain blues standards, and everybody can play it a little different though.
Yeah.
So the way Hendrix played it versus Stevie Ray Vaughan, they're two different blues, Texas bluesmen versus a cosmic guy doing this cosmic blues. Like
Mhm.
Hendrixian blues is not the same, but they could
Yeah.
both sing Red House, but they don't come
Yeah.
out the same way.
Yeah. Yeah. I just heard someone singing some Christmas songs the other day, very familiar songs, and I thought, wow, she put her stamp on those. It was nice.
Yeah, and so like and then sometimes we can take little snippets of pieces of things,
Hmm.
and then it's not as recognizable. You might not recognize that where that came from. It doesn't hit you over the head, but it's like that's our talent is to pull these disparate things and then turn it into a cohesive story.
Yeah. Well, in a way, it's like an alphabet. We only got so many letters, and we all use the same letters. But look at the amazing variety
Breath
that's
of it, yeah.
created out of the same, alphabet.
Cool.
Or
Yes, that's to
yeah.
pull known, like we call it, like known sounds versus unknown, newfound sounds.
Hmm.
There's certain piano sounds everybody knows that sound, and then we get people like myself. It's like I'll actually tune the piano to be different,
Uh,
or I'll create a tone from scratch with an oscillator that didn't exist. So it's not the native sound you would get off a violin or a piano. It's
uh-huh.
actually a whole new
A
sound.
new. Oh, that's
So
amazing.
that's a
Yeah.
different type of thinking where you actually invent something totally new. But then you might use the pentatonic scale, which everybody knows, but
Hmm.
the sound in it was unknown. So you're still
So
using
it's
some
that
structure,
blending of the
blending of different
familiar and
things.
the novel. Yeah.
Yeah, so you
Yeah.
can kind of do that at different degrees. Where certain, like with as an author, like certain themes, right? There's probably certain structures or certain, your editors could go and say, oh, well, I've seen this and maybe this doesn't flow right. I
Yeah.
don't know. That's how they
Oh,
come back to you.
absolutely. And even the idea of a coming of age book, there's been thousands and thousands and thousands of coming of age books, and to some extent, they're going to deal with similar themes, but hopefully you write one that
That's the secret sauce.
hasn't been written before.
Yeah, it has that angle that's like, well, this is what draws you in. This is what keeps you in the book.
Yeah.
Keeps you in the 75,000, 90,000 pages. This is what keeps you in.
Yeah.
And that's always the big challenge as a writer, because like a lot of people wanted, the algorithms out there in the world because of social media, they beg you to do the same thing.
Yeah.
They kind of are driving for you to make the next cat video.
Right.
It's like, well, like, how many cat videos can there be?
Yeah.
I guess there could always be another one.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, as a psychologist, you think, well, people, there's only so many psychological issues, in the world, or problems or conflicts. But yet every person is so unique.
Different.
It's amazing in a way, that you don't think, oh yeah, I've met you before. You're just like that other person. No, never. You never.
Well, it's that unique voice that you can construct, and I think maybe you have the benefit of hearing a lot of voices in your work, which if somebody's been more of a solitary writer and maybe they travel, but they haven't actually communicated with as many people, right, over time.
Yeah.
It gives you like a big like reservoir or archive or in your toolbox of,
Yeah.
like, I got all these stories I can mix and match. I can change the text. I can change the age. I can change this. I can change the actual moment and flip it around a little bit. So it ends up being like we do with samples today. Like in music, I can sample some 1974 R&B song, but then I could invert it. I could slow it down. I could change all different kinds of aspects of it where you wouldn't even know where it came from.
Right.
You have no idea where it came from.
Right.
But it was kind of started as this like resource that I can mine and then refine and change. Or you could just keep it the same. But like it's more interesting as the author of it to actually play with inverting and converting and reverting.
It sounds like great fun, actually. And I think for a writer, like what working as a psychologist has given me is knowing people really deeply and their complexity. In some ways, the way you'd know somebody if you're married to them, with a lot of complexity, a lot of history. Even people who don't have that kind of experience, I think you have a lot of interactions in the world that are really useful. Just riding the bus, as if you're a fiction writer, riding the bus, all kinds of things.
You're very good observers. I've met a lot of writers that maybe didn't have as many personal relationships as with them, but super observant of the world itself.
Absolutely. They walk into the convenience store and just notice things about the way people interact or look, but that complex biography of a person, that's something you do get as a psychologist that probably isn't as easy to come by.
Yeah, I think it gives you maybe a leg up on some other writers in terms of like that. But it's
I don't know. I hope so, but I don't know.
Well, that's your secret ingredient. But it just seems like when you're writing though, it's have you found as a writer, it's like you do it because you love it, right? Like I talk to a lot of musicians and they will play for free. They will go and do some just because they love to play music. And it's not about like, oh, I gotta be number one on the algorithm. It's more like I write because I write, or I'm a creative because I kind of have to. Like it's
Mhm.
kind of cathartic to me.
Yeah, I definitely identify with that. And even, writers who keep going when they're not having success publishing, it's because for some people it's ambition, but I think for a lot of people it's just something about the activity that feeds your soul and you kind of need it. I once went to a writing conference and we were divided up into smaller groups, and there was one man in the group that I was in who, when they went around and did introductions and they asked people what they wanted to get from the conference, he said, "I've written 9 novels. I haven't been able to publish any of them. I need help giving up writing." And of course, I don't think he really meant it,
I
but
think you meant that. You really
he
meant
wanted
it.
help quitting. But
You can't really quit if you're gonna keep on writing that.
but he couldn't quit because he was a writer by,
There's this like the
nature. Yeah,
nature. You're just like a painter. He's like, you gotta paint. You
yeah.
know, whether or not it's in the gallery or not. There's maybe it gets found later, like William Blake.
That's right. You do it because something in you needs to do it. Yeah, yeah. But I think
So
sometimes
yeah.
the fiction writing sometimes can feed the nonfiction too. Like the nonfiction book that I wrote for teenagers was called "When Parents Have Problems," and
Mm,
there I was trying to speak to kids who have psychologically troubled parents, older kids, teenagers,
mhm.
and they're trying to grow up as healthily, successfully as they can, but they actually have parents who are,
Holding them
getting
back.
getting in the way. Yeah. Yeah, and there are a lot of books for the parents who are having trouble with their kids, but this was the kids who are having trouble with their
Yeah,
parents.
that's a good. That I never. There actually probably needs to be more books like that. 'Cause I think
Yeah.
that's a big problem.
It's hard to get them into the hands of kids, I think, but I do think it's a worthwhile effort. And there, maybe being a fiction writer helped because it was easier for me to write in a story-like fashion or simply just kind of speak directly to younger people, no
Hmm.
jargon. And um,
I think
so,
that was an important angle because I think that is a problem because like you don't always you don't get to pick your parents, but sometimes your parents some societies just feel like oh because they're older than you that they're wiser than you.
right.
That's not always the case.
It's not always the case, and kids carry that around too, that, deep belief that the parent somehow must be right and the child's at fault or the child's just a disappointment, and so much damage can be done to kids, you know, with parents who really just have big problems of their own and they don't necessarily parent very wisely because of their own shortcomings. So.
Yeah, and sometimes society just gives them a lot of latitude. The parents, well, you're in there, you're in charge because you're the all adult in the room. So
Right.
if you can't prove it to the law that you're actually doing something wrong, then it can keep on going on.
And usually it does, unless the parent um, gets help, makes a big turnaround and recognizes their shortcomings, which sometimes happens, but often not.
Yeah, then you end up having to deal with people who come to your office who maybe are dealing with the fact that they had a parent that was like very not helpful to their emotional development.
Right, right, yeah. Yeah, and with this book, I actually had been working with a teenager who had a pretty troubled parent, and I was noticing how just being realistic with the girl about what problems were not hers, but actually were her mother's or her father's. It was a long time ago, so I don't remember the particulars. But I could see how helpful it was to her just to be able to say, "Okay, I'm not crazy. this is
Separate
this is an
what's you.
unreasonable expectation of my mother. And I wasn't trying to get her to hate her mother or
Mhm.
blame her, aggressively blame her, but just see what was reality.
And what's hers and what's like her mom's,
Yeah,
or
right.
what's her dad.
Separate it out, not feel like she had to um, live her whole life trying to placate a angry parent or please a parent who can't be pleased.
Yeah, sometimes you have to get out of that loop
Yeah,
because sometimes like you have to reprogram your own framework, like your own mindset. And sometimes you can't you can't change your parents' mindset or your
right,
grandparents' mindset or your uncle's mindset. That might be locked in, and if they don't solve it, they're still in that loop.
right.
But you could get out of the loop.
Yeah, and that was the whole point, is to try and talk directly to the kids about things they can do to help themselves, protect themselves, put themselves on a path to a better future that they can do them by themselves. Or maybe sometimes go find another adult in your world, a teacher or a pastor, somebody
Going to be a
who's
mentor for
yeah,
somebody to
yeah,
help you.
is it more on your side? Yeah.
But sometimes people think they're like alone in the world that they don't realize that other people feel the same things, and that's why it's great to have books and have songs and have art because then people start to see, oh, I felt this way. Right. So then it's like I'm not the only one that feels this way.
Yeah, and I think I agree. I think in songs are probably so important to people in that regard. And books too, but songs are a little easier access sometimes, quick,
Yeah, which
like,
quicker,
oh, you
the
just,
quicker hit because
yeah,
two,
and
3 minutes,
suddenly,
4 minutes versus like 90,000 words.
yeah, and suddenly you listen to a song and suddenly maybe feel, yeah, less isolated, especially teenagers, I think can feel really alone because they may not have had those conversations with other people that let them see that, oh, the things I'm thinking about, actually other people think about too, or things I'm worried about or scared about.
What do you think about? Have you worked on like audio versions of your books? Have you gone into like having audio book versions of any of your work?
I haven't. I would love to, but I actually haven't. I think that would be a lot of fun to have
Yeah,
that
because it's just like a
experience.
different frame. There's some people that have a hard time getting into reading, but there's a whole group of people today that like audiobooks is like that's how they get their books.
Absolutely. Lots of people. Yeah.
And then like as an author, like your voice can actually have like it's like a poetic like when you have a reading, if you ever go and you read a passage from
Hmm.
your book to an audience, it's
Right.
kind of like a poet reading to a
Yeah.
people at a coffee shop. It can have a different effect when you actually read it versus
Yeah.
read it out
Yeah.
loud versus reading it
Yeah.
on
That
paper.
experience I've had, and it's a nice experience, but having a whole book read, either you probably have to be an actor, not me,
Yeah.
because it takes a lot of skill to do a good
There's a
job
little
with that. Yeah. Then there are some wonderful actors actually reading audiobooks. So yeah, I'd love that. And you could be surprised by it too, just like those covers that somebody else
yeah,
designs.
it's about how
It-
it interprets your work.
right. That would be
Yeah, I did have
interesting.
a fellow that was on it, like a big advocate of authors doing their own book because he feels even though you're not an actor, like you're probably the best person to read your own work.
Oh,
That
okay.
was
Well,
his pitch. That's his
huh,
pitch. But
that's
um
interesting. Yeah.
but it's interesting. Kinda, yeah, it depends because it's hard because a lot of people feel like, well, I'm not an actor, so I can't do it. I don't have a radio voice, so I could do. But that's kind of like any musician. But the second before you actually started singing your song, you
Hmm.
always think there's somebody else that could sing it better.
Oh,
Until you
really?
until you decide like, "Well, you know what? I have my own voice, I'm gonna sing it." And there always is somebody that could theoretically sing something better,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's your work, and
Yeah.
when it's your own work, it actually sounds better with your own voice. Right.
And you
Yeah,
have
that's my
some, yeah, amazing I was thinking for some reason of Bob Dylan, well,
Yeah.
not really a beautiful voice, but yet, boy,
But his delivery is
he
so
got, it was
unique.
wonderful, right? He got, the heart of
Yeah,
those songs.
yeah. Because if you have other people sing his songs, but when Bob sings his own song,
Yeah.
there's something about the way he tells that story. And
Hmm.
the thing about Bob is like his voice has different. There are different versions of his voice.
Hmm.
Like there's a Nashville Skyline version. There's kind of this nasal, kind
Yeah.
of cartoony version. There's a kind of playing it straight version. He has a lot of variations on his voice, and people say, "Oh, he can't sing." It's like I beg to differ. As a musician, I've listened to his many versions of his voice, and he actually can change his character of his voice.
That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
So I mean, it's something
And
you
you would,
learn.
yeah, the world would be a poorer place if we hadn't heard all those songs in his voice.
Yeah, there's something about when an artist can present, their work to the world, and that's like when the reason why you pick up the pen or you get on the typewriter, because you feel like you have a way to say something, and you've given yourself the permission structure once you start typing, right? That the world should hear it or read it or,
Yeah.
listen to
And
it, right?
that's so important because I think that's what stops so many people is they don't give themselves that permission. And you have to, I know when I was very young and I loved reading other people's work, and I was had this passion that I wanted to write, but I was so perfectionistic. I
Yeah,
would
too
drive
perfect.
myself crazy over every word. And then it was torture. There was no fun in it at all. I was never satisfied. And I think at some point I realized
You let that go.
you got to, if you don't figure out another approach, you can't do this. And so, yeah, somehow I let it go. I learned how to just write. And the editor can come back later. The
Yeah,
editor and you will be back later and do a lot of work, but you got to
yeah.
let the voice come out first, unedited. If
But I
it's,
think that's a real important thing that
yeah.
we always end up taking, we're at an hour mark, but it goes by quicker than we ever imagined.
Hmm.
But I think I'll leave the audience with that. It's like you can give yourself permission because nobody else has a voice like yourself, your own voice. And it doesn't have to be perfect. Perfection's like the enemy of getting anything done
Sure is.
because you're never going to get it done if you think we're humans. So it's not going to be perfect. So just realize that from the start. But thank you again for being a guest on the Family Electric Ghost podcast. We've just been live on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch. We're going to be on all the other platforms where you can listen to or watch a podcast by tomorrow. I want to thank you again for being on the podcast. Yeah, Susan Miller on here. So thank you very much. And I do encourage people to check out the Amazon link we have there. It'll be fully clickable, and they can check out all the books that you've written. And particularly, we've been talking about By the Way I Love You, which is your new book, your new YA book. So thank you again for being on the show.
Thank you very much, Phantom. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Bye.